I want to do a quick introduction of Jonathan Murray, although he probably needs no introduction. But since the launch of Real World on MTV in 1992 through his then company Bunim Murray Productions, Jonathan Murray has created and executive produced some of the industry's most innovative, unscripted entertainment television programs, including, and I'm sure many of you are aware of his show Born This Way, which documents the lives of 7 diverse young adults with Down syndrome and their families. It has been nominated for 13 Emmys and won 3. In 2007, he produced Autism the Musical on HBO, which also won 2 Emmy Awards. Currently, he's an executive consultant for Bunim Murray Productions. In 2012, he was inducted into the Television Academy Hall of Fame. I don't need to be going on and on about all of his accolades because his work speaks for himself. I'm going to show a short video first? Yes. Okay. I'm going to show a short video that all the interviews were conducted by Jonathan, and the video itself was edited by one of our other board members, Andrew Egan. So thank you to our board members for their active participation.
I'm an actress.
I'm an actor.
I'm also an actor.
I am an actor with autism.
As an actor with a disability,
I want to be able to audition for 80 roles.
As an actor with a disability, I want to be treated just like everyone else.
If we want to be fair and let all actors play all kinds of roles, that means people with disabilities should be allowed to play the moms and the teachers and the neighbors.
People are just uncomfortable with what is not considered the norm, which is why representation matters.
Only in a couple occasions have I been cast in a character role using my prosthetics, but it had nothing to do with the role.
just to be called in for just a role as a character who happens to be blind, but the character itself is not written as this is a blind character.
And so I've gone in for 2 roles that had nothing to do with the wheelchair.
We can do action roles. Hearing people have been doing it a lot, so why not a deaf person? To see what it would be like. Maybe people would be like, whoa, that is so cool.
I could play a lawyer, I want to be a lawyer, or if I could be someone's dad.
A mom, the love interest, the friend of the love interest, the judge. So many different roles. The possibilities are endless.
Some of the biggest roles I've had, I've literally snuck past all the gatekeepers and got in the door, and then the creative people get their hands on it and they're like, oh, wait a minute, that's pretty fun to write for.
That's my hope, that one day, you know, they'll look at us and be like, oh, you know, that's a normal person, she just can't see.
Support the inclusion writer today.
Respectability.
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 Hi, everybody. So our panel is called Fighting Implicit Bias Through TV and Film. So how do you fight implicit bias through TV and film? For me, it's by introducing viewers to worlds and people they don't know, by focusing on love, compassion, and empathy, by celebrating differences rather than fearing them. I think all of the panelists have done this in their work, and I'm honored to be joined on this panel by Dr. Jeanette Betancourt, Crystal Renee Emery, Andrew Solomon, and Rachel Dretzen. I'll tell you more about each of them before we move to their section. For me, my fight to introduce and celebrate previously marginalized communities began with The Real World, the show I created in 1992, where the show was basically you put 7 diverse young people together to find out what happens when people stop being polite and start getting real, to quote the main title. And it was, you know, when I went off to college, I found myself with a black roommate, and I had grown up in a mostly white world, and I made some really stupid mistakes with him out of my ignorance, but I grew up a lot. And so I was thinking of that when we created The Real World, and how if we put people of different geographic backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, different races, different sexual orientation, how much learning could come, and that learning would be our story arc. And I think, you know, in looking at the real world, I know for a generation of young people who are growing up gay or lesbian or transgendered, seeing images of themselves, seeing positive images of themselves on television in those formative years really changed how they felt about themselves, and it also moved the needle in terms of how their classmates felt about them. In Project Runway, we were fortunate to be able to, again, cast diversity. It was really interesting. I'm not sure why, but so many of those young designers who were in Project Runway were first-generation Americans. I don't know what it is about the immigrant experience, but it does seem to lead to, you know, a hell of an ability to produce like gorgeous, gorgeous designs on the runway. And maybe that being an outsider allows you sometimes to see things that, you know, other people who aren't privileged to be outsiders don't see. And then in Autism the Musical, again, our focus was looking at families who had felt marginalized by having a child with autism and take a deep dive into how that affects a family. And then most recently with Born This Way, it was this wonderful opportunity to look at really this first generation of young adults who had Down syndrome, but whose parents from the very beginning like had this goal for their child to help them be the best they can be, and that meant often having them participate in mainstream schools, and also it came a time where the parents had to fight for it, but they were able to get some of the resources needed to help their child be the best they could be. And in our show, what's interesting is these young people are now 25 to 30, and the parents did such a great job raising them to be independent as they take those final steps of moving out and forming relationships away from the home. The parents are scared to death, which is a very common experience if you're a parent. It's scary to let go. One of the things I did learn on Born This Way, and it's interesting, is that when we got our first cut of the show, I realized that we had taken the easy way out in often letting the parents speak for their children. And these are, when I say children, they are their children, but they are now in their mid to late 20s and early 30s. So we went back in on that first cut, and really wherever we could have the young person tell his own story, we did that because we really felt it was important to let them tell their story. And yes, we wanted to hear from the parents, but we only wanted to really hear from the parents about their journey. We wanted to have our cast members be full participants in our documentary series. Which brings me to the latest project we're doing, which will air in September on A&E. It's called Deaf Out Loud. And this show is about deaf culture and about three families who are deaf, but who really show the multitude of ways that the deaf community manifests itself. It's not one approach for all in terms of how these parents are raising their deaf children in a hearing world. Some of the families are ASL only and choose not to speak even if they can. Others will speak, or if they can, and they will embrace technology, whether it's a cochlear implant or a hearing aid. And in putting together the show, again, we had to be very careful because it's very easy as someone who has hearing privilege it's easy to go to the soundbite with the deaf person who also speaks. Whereas the person who uses ASL only, it's like they need to have equal representation. And so it was interesting, and we showed, I'm going to show you a trailer for the show, And we actually showed it to our deaf families, and they sort of called me up on maybe my hearing privilege had not been quite fair enough to the ASL only folks. So we recut the trailer. So anyway, so you can always learn, and I think one of the things I've learned is that when I tell these kinds of stories, I need to educate myself and really listen a lot. So let's, I'm not going to push the buttons, so Lauren, are you here? If I don't push the buttons, then she's responsible if it doesn't go right. Another secret to success. Have deniability. So this is a little trailer for Deaf Out Loud that's going to appear on A&E Network in September. Anyway, I feel so fortunate to have gotten to spend so much time with those families, and I'm looking forward to sharing this special with America. So start talking it up on social media. I'm very excited to now transition to Andrew Solomon and Rachel Dretzin. I think probably most of you know Andrew as a writer, lecturer on psychology, politics, and the arts, an activist on LGBT rights, mental health and the arts, best-selling author, Far and Away, Stone Boat, The Noonday Demon, and Far From the Tree, Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity, which was a 2012 National Book Critics Award winner. And he's a professor of clinical psychology at Columbia University Medical Center. And he wrote this amazing book, Far From the Tree. And then Rachel came along and said, I want to make a documentary about this. And she's an award-winning filmmaker and has produced numerous documentaries for PBS's Frontline since the mid-90s, including Growing Up Online and Digital Nation, and she's a multiple Emmy nominee and an Emmy winner. So I'm not sure where to begin. I guess I'll turn it over to you both, and maybe starting with Andrew and asking him how he got the idea to write this book, and then maybe then what Rachel was doing when she suddenly discovered it, and how it was going to him and asking to make a documentary based on it.
Well, the book really began because in 1994 I was asked by my editors at the New York Times Magazine to write an article about deaf culture. And I was very taken aback. First of all, because I had no idea there was a deaf culture. I had led a very protected life. I always thought that poor deaf people, they can't hear, what can we do for them? And second of all, because I had mostly been doing foreign reporting. And Adam said, this is a piece of foreign reporting in our own country. And I went out into the deaf world, and I went to deaf clubs, and I went to deaf theater, and I became deeply involved in the deaf world. And I remember walking into a meeting at the National Association of the Deaf and thinking, I wish I were deaf. Not that I wished I couldn't hear, but I saw conversations flying off the ends of everyone's hands, and I thought it was a very beautiful culture, and in that moment I felt very marginal to it. I then found out that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, but those parents have often encouraged them to join in whatever way they can the mainstream world, and that those people then discover deaf culture in adolescence or thereafter when it comes as a great liberation to them. And I thought how similar that was to the experience of gay people, who are in general born to straight parents, who try to get them to operate in what they see as the mainstream, and who eventually manage to find gay culture in adolescence or thereafter when it comes as a great liberation. And then a friend of mine had a daughter who was a dwarf. And I found her asking what had now become rather familiar questions. Do I tell her she's just like everyone else, only short? Or do I try to breathe some kind of sense of dwarf identity into her and get her to recognize herself as part of a special and select group? And as she narrated her concerns, I thought, well, here it is again, a family that perceives itself to be normal with a child whom they perceive to be aberrant, trying to make sense of how to bring that child up, and trying to figure out what aspects of your child's difference should you be curing, what should you be celebrating. In the time I was writing out the deaf, I had done a lot of work on the cochlear implant. I think most of you know the general arguments, so I won't rehearse them here and now. So the book really became an investigation of what I called horizontal identities. Vertical identities, I posited, are identities that are passed down generation to generation by families. Things like race, ethnicity, nationality, usually language, often religion. But you can say that some of those identities are difficult. I mean, it's still easier in the United States as it's constructed in most places to be white than to be a person of color. But no one is doing research to ensure that the next generation of children of color come out with blonde hair and blue eyes. But I said there are also what I call horizontal identities. Horizontal because they aren't passed down family trees from parent to child. There are characteristics a child has that may be different from the characteristics of that child's parents. So things like deafness and dwarfism and autism and Down syndrome and schizophrenia, things even including being a prodigy, being a criminal, being a child born in rape, or being transgender. And as I looked in all of these categories, I came to feel increasingly the difference, which seems to isolate people so much, is in fact the thing we most have in common. That everyone, even people whose children aren't as dramatically different as the ones I was looking at, has children who sometimes seem alien and foreign, and that everyone has an ongoing need to figure out how to love children who aren't what they imagined when they set out to have children. And so I feel by looking from the world of gayness and from the world of disability and from the world of these other categories that I looked at, I found a great unifying sense that our differences can in fact unite us.
I guess we're a tag team these days. So I'm Rachel Drutson, and I'm a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker, and have made many films over the years, some of them, quite a few of them, about families and growing up in this country. But I'd never worked on anything about disability before. I read Andrew's book when it was shortly after it was published in 2012 and was completely transformed by the experience. Those of you who've read it will probably know what I mean. It's a really profound work of art, and I was seized with the desire to turn it into a film, in part because the stories in the book, and there are about 300 of them, are extremely cinematic in many ways, and also because it's a book about the sort of challenges and difficulties of love and about the ways in which love prevails. And I found that incredibly moving and inspiring. So I wrote to Andrew, who actually was at college with me, although we didn't really know each other. We had some mutual friends in common, and I wrote and reintroduced myself and asked him if he had thought about making the book into a film. And he responded that there were about 30 other filmmakers with the same idea. So that began our very prolonged courtship, in which I tried to woo him to choose me, and ultimately prevailed, which I'm delighted to say resulted in Far From the Tree, the documentary, which is being released theatrically by Sundance Selects, and which is in theaters right now in New York and in Los Angeles. Will be opening in theaters in Boston, Washington, Philadelphia, Chicago, and all over the country in the coming weeks, and is also available on demand. And this documentary took us about 4 years to make. Andrew's a producer on the film, as well as being in the film, because his story actually frames his book as it frames the film. And because the book took him a decade to write and had already been published for some time when I started to film the documentary, I decided almost immediately that we couldn't use the same stories that Andrew used in his book, and that we had to find new stories, because most of the people in the book had moved into a different phase of their lives by the time we were filming the documentary. So the documentary features 5 families, one dealing with a child who's autistic, another family has a son with Down syndrome, a dwarf couple trying to have a baby, and another young woman with dwarfism who's sort of finding people like herself for the first time. And then the final story in the film is the story of a family who has a son 16-year-old son who murders a child. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what the film looks at. We have a trailer for the film. Is that something we want to do now, or
Sure, sure. I think people should.
Yeah, I
see
think
it.
it's probably a good time to see it, and then you guys will have a sense of how the film works.
This is a call from an offender at a Louisiana Department of Corrections facility.
What, baby?
All parents deal with children who are not what they imagine. My parents really didn't want to have a gay son. I wanted to see how other families managed it. That I don't want to know just about families of gay people. I wanted to look as widely as I could.
By July, we knew he had autism, and I just assumed that he was impaired.
You have to sit in your chair. Take this.
It was overwhelming. I didn't want it.
He was shackled in a prison strike.
You know as soon as you see him, the worst has happened, and it is not going to be okay.
You go back to when they were in the cradle, and you wonder if you let them cry too long. I don't have an easy answer. A mother can't just stop loving a child.
Personally, I'm very against the idea that someone is researching to find a cure for my type of dwarfism. It's the same message our whole lives. There's something wrong with you and we need to fix it. I don't think I need to be fixed. We did allergy testing,
music therapy,
saw a naturopath, chiropractor,
hyperbaric oxygen therapy, speech therapy. We thought that he should talk. We talk. So he needs to learn how to talk.
He started spelling letters with the stencils. Typed out, I am trying, and I am really smart. It's like I was meeting him for the first time.
In some ways, I wrote in the book to forgive my parents. And in telling these stories, I was investigating the very nature of family itself.
Before we go on to our next panels, I guess my big question is, Andrew's book was, what, 800 pages? Your film is 93 minutes. How do you do that? Is there a special sauce? Is it less is more? What is it?
Well, I mean, first of all, the film and the book are very related, but not the same. So, you know, the film doesn't try to do what the book does. The film tries to distill the very special spirit of the book and perspective of the book into an extremely different medium. And so they're companions to each other, but they're not actually the same. And I think that's something that Andrew and I discussed very early on. I felt really strongly there was no way, unless you're doing an 8-hour series, and even then, to try and do what he did. And you know, it's also interesting how sort of kind of distilled the medium, the visual medium is. And so you can say in a look, or a gaze, or a word, or an image, something that's very concentrated. It's almost like, you know, it is a special sauce. It's like the liquid that you're swimming in when you're reading a book is just a drop. With a movie, and you can kind of get so much information from that. So I do think that it surprised both of us how much of what the themes are in the book is translated into the film, even though the film is so much shorter. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words.
Exactly.
Right?
Maybe I should have just said that.
All right, we're going to move over to our next guest, Dr. Jeanette Betancourt. She's the Senior Vice President for U.S. Social Impact at Sesame Workshop. I think I was the last generation to grow up without Sesame Street. Dr. Betancourt is a licensed bilingual speech and language pathologist and educational therapist. She also serves on a number of boards and committees that support children and families. She conceptualizes and implements Sesame's models for delivery of outreach initiatives that affect and engage children, families, caregivers, educators, particularly to meet the needs of children and adults in underserved communities. And I'm so thrilled to meet you and have you on this panel.
Thank you so much. It's truly a privilege to be here. After that introduction, it's often people forget my name and simply say it's the Sesame Street lady. So you can always remember me as that. I say it's a privilege to be here because in a certain way we're slightly different than everyone else who's presented thus far. And that's particularly because of the audience in which we are mostly focused on, and that's very young children. Let me tell you a little bit about Sesame Workshop and particularly our work around autism and why we are here. Sesame Workshop is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to help all children around the world grow up smarter, stronger, and kinder. And the reason I bring up our mission is because we also believe that in order to accomplish that, particularly because we are focused on young children, we need the important people in children's lives, or what we often say is the circle of care, to help nourish that mission. So Jonathan mentioned our longevity of his maybe being a generation that hasn't grown up with Sesame Street. Next year, we will experience our 50th anniversary, which is rather incredible, and it's, well, thank you, but it's all because of people such as yourselves. And once again, I bring that up because now we are targeting 3 generations. So that means that within this group, there are parents who themselves grew up on Sesame Street. They are sharing it with their children. There are grandparents, as well as sharing it with their grandchildren. So what that means is that we believe very strongly in that circle of care. Part of our mission in order to do that is, most of you know us through our programming, but coupled with that from inception is the belief that we must go into communities. We must create what we call community and family engagement. And that's how the emergence of our work around Sesame Street and autism, See Amazing in All Children, came about. Approximately throughout our history of Sesame Street as well, we believe very much from day one on representation of inclusion in its widest form, whether it was different abilities, different strengths, different races, ethnicities, culture, languages, and we represented that very early on. And in fact, when we first launched in certain states, we were banned as a result of that. But in that area, we've also been very inclusive of different abilities, and always from a strength-based perspective. But over time, one of the things that we kept hearing, particularly from the autism community, was this incredible affinity between our wonderful Muppets and children on the spectrum. This connection that allowed them to have both an emotional and also a safe connection. Simultaneously, what also started to occur was this emphasis also on the numbers of children impacted. And at that time when we were first launching, and since then it's actually a higher number, it was 1 in 68 children. And as we started to do what we usually do in our research model is there a need for Sesame to play a role? Is there a role that we can play? And what we do is we go through a very intense process of finding that out. What that is we gather experts. We also go into the community and start hearing not only from those impacted by having an autistic child, and particularly a focus on young children, but also what we call the general public, those parents who have typically developing children in this age group. We also went around to what we call providers, hearing from those who service children who are autistic, and also those who service in inclusion. And where we first started, we thought, oh, we're Sesame. We may create something that may help on social emotional development or learning. What we learned was that was not the role that many wished for us to impart. Rather, what they saw for us was the role that we usually play, and that is the role of inclusion. They said to us, the one thing that we would like to see is representation of an autistic child within everyday moments, and just the emphasis that all children, what they share in common. All children want to play, all children want friends, all children engage in everyday moments. So as we did further, we discovered that our role was creating an initiative that holistically did a couple of things. It reduced the stigma around autism by simply learning to talk about what is autism from a child's perspective, but also modeling it for the grown-ups around them. More importantly, we also wanted to do it from a strength-based perspective and show, as we always do, an autistic character, a wonderful Muppet by the name of Julia, who's 4 years old, in the context of her Sesame friends. And it was really from the autism community who drove us to say, bring her into your programming as part of what you do. What I'd like to do is show you a little segment, and now Lauren, poor Lauren, who has now, oh, I have
Lauren has been replaced.
Lauren has been replaced.
Xavier.
Thank you.
Oh, hi there. It's me, Abby Cadabby. Did you know that I have a new friend on Sesame Street? It's true. Her name is Julia. She is sparkle-tastic. Do you want to meet her? You do? Okay, take a look.
Here's some more paper, guys.
Oh, thanks, Allie.
You're welcome.
Okay, just a little more green.
Oh, that's nice.
Thank you.
Oh, hey, welcome to Sesame Street.
Oh, hi.
We are having some fun with finger paints.
Oh, hi guys. Hi Elmo. Hi Abby. Hi Alan.
Hi.
Oh, who's this?
Oh, this is our friend Julia.
Oh, hi Julia. I'm Big Bird. Nice to meet you. Oh, Julia?
Julia's just concentrating on her painting right now. You guys,
Oh.
you're all doing a great job.
Huh. Huh, Ellen. I don't think Julia likes me very much.
Oh, no, you two are just meeting for the first time.
Oh, so she's shy. Oh, I get that. I can feel shy sometimes too.
Well, with Julia, it's not just that. You see, she has autism. She likes it when people know that.
Autism? Well, what's autism?
Well, for Julia, it means that she might not answer you right away.
Yeah, Julia doesn't say a lot.
That's right. And she may not do what you expect, like give you a high five.
Yeah, she does things just a little differently, in a Julia sort of way.
Oh, okay.
And she's a lot of fun. Yeah. Oh, Julia likes being with her friends. Oh, and she loves to play, too. Play. You want to play now, Julia? Play. Oh, okay. We can all play together.
Hey, that's a great idea.
Oh, me too. Can I play?
Sure thing. Okay, so what should we play?
How about tag?
I think that's a yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. But why did we do this in a context? It goes back to our mission and why you are all here. All of you have a positive approach. You all are advocates. You all believe very much in inclusion. But if you go back to where you started all of your acceptance, your way of thinking, it really starts in those early years. And our belief is that in order for there to be inclusion, in order there to be acceptance, you really start to have this in those very, very early years. Our goal And we have found this through our research, is that our entire initiative, because it's not just Julia, there's representation of many aspects of children who are autistic in our initiative, is really the focus that it has driven conversations and connections between the general community and the autistic community. I'll give you 2 examples. One was when we first started to hear in our research, and differences after showing a lot of our resources, was this particular mother who had a 4-year-old child, also a boy, who was on the spectrum, who was much more impacted. And she described that when she went into a playground, as opposed to her typically developing children, they would all suddenly come around their children, and everyone, whether strangers or friends, would accept them and would get automatically engaged in play. She said when she walked in with her son, suddenly it was like the seas parted. On a more positive note, we heard back from actually a teen girl who was autistic and saw the first episode of Meet Julia. And she wrote on social media that when she first saw this, and then subsequently also read the digital book, she said, "I'm amazing too. And for the first time, I'm seeing someone like myself when I was young." So it is the idea of how can we form through media a sense of inclusion and understanding from birth and from all of you as being key implementers of creating that circle of care. So thank you.
Thank you. I just had one question. With what we had done, we have a number of different people who might represent something. You have one character for autism. In some ways, that I think that can be very challenging because, as we know, autism is a spectrum and it can represent so many. What it must have been challenging, and how did you sort of end up where you ended up?
Well, it was in the context of the whole initiative. So See Amazing includes quite a bit of a spectrum of children and families, and children who are across, whether impacted more significantly or less so, male, female, different race and ethnicity. But we particularly, in looking at all of the context, we also addressed one component. Many times we're asked, why did we pick a girl as opposed to a boy, since there is much more prevalence in males? And the reason we did that was because we wanted to, again, represent the diversity, in fact, of autism. And finally, we also wanted to select, and we did quite a bit of research on that, a child who had more difficulties, let's say, in being very verbally communicating, but using other mechanisms to communicate. And that's shown throughout our program. So we did a balance.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Crystal Renee Emery. She's an award-winning producer, writer, director, filmmaker, and activist. Ms. Emery, who's a friend of mine, is the executive director of You Are You, The Right to Be, an organization that fosters communication and understanding through the arts among diverse racial, social, and economic groups. Many of her initiatives flow from that basic idea. Recently, she conceived and oversaw a summit in Washington at the National Academy of Sciences to mobilize doctors, engineers, mathematicians, and scientists to develop strategies for inclusion and to inspire hundreds of young people of color to take up careers in STEM. She's also a children's author, and but what we're here to look at today is a documentary she did that's titled Black Women in Medicine, and we're actually going to play the clip first on this.
Picture in your mind an open heart surgery. Did you imagine the surgeon to be a black woman?
As a black woman, are there more challenges? Absolutely. It was just assumed that I was not the surgeon.
I would walk into a room and you would get, when is the real surgeon coming to see me?
Every stereotype, I was not supposed to make it.
I had never seen a doctor before I went to college, and you can't be what you can't see.
I get challenged by the system, by my colleagues, by others, in a way that a white man would not be challenged. When I'm doing something new, when I'm doing something cutting edge, there is definitely much more of a spotlight.
Some people even believe and buy into that post-racial statement. There's nothing post-racial in this country. Race matters. It's the first thing they see when people look at you.
We change history by not giving up the struggle. We still have to train another generation of young black girls. Open up these opportunities for them. Let them see the women who have accomplished so much and be inspired.
Having a diverse medical force is extremely important. To have the ability to be an example and a role model, to say this is something that I can do. Medicine is a career that I can aspire to.
As these trailblazers have shown, the young black female physicians that are emerging today can do anything they really want to do.
You know what the problem is? I'm so used to walking around, right? So I'm trying to figure out how to do me and stay put. Quite difficult. Give me a second. Let's try to stay put. All right, turn me off. Okay. Okay, you can hear me, right? Yeah. All right, thank you so much, John. I'm giving honor today to that power within me that wakes me up every morning. Some people call it divine intelligence. I call it God. And I'm just so honored to be here. I learned something 1 minute ago. So you just saw my clip for Black Women in Medicine, but the words I put in front of it for today. So the words, we are innovators, right? I felt like coming here, I didn't want to say, well, as a disabled person, or I wanted to say as an innovator. So I put that together, but I never saw it. So seeing it, I go, wow, that could have been an opening for the film. But it was really about this moment and how the word innovators turned into love. And I love what I do. And I think love transcends race and gender and physicalities. And that the more we learn to love and look at what we have in common, it'll make a much better world. The Me Too movement is sweeping across America, right? As many women, brave women, step forward from shadows of secrecy, shame to share their painful stories of sexual abuse, intimidation, and exploitation at the hands of powerful, ruthless men. Hollywood has stepped up, right, to address this inequality and abuse of power in the studio system. Yet, the disabled community within the industry are not valued for our creativity, for our intelligence, for our sensitivity, and our managerial skills. So what's going on? Fighting implicit bias through TV and film, I can speak with authority about that subject. Okay, I gotta move. Turn me on, CJ. I'm sorry. You know, I told somebody last night, lift my arm up. How do I describe myself? And I describe myself as energy in motion, right? So I just need that you move away. Kick that under the table, the car. And let's move the mic out, it bends. It can bend. Okay. Sorry. Let me get comfortable so I can do me right. What you may see before you today is a black woman in a wheelchair. Let me tell you, first and foremost, I am a filmmaker. Not to mention an artist, author, wife, parent, educator, activist, and a great cook. As a filmmaker, which is my first love, I've written and produced, directed 2 feature films, documentaries, several shorts. I have worked with some of the biggest giants in the industry. People like Forrest Whitaker, Gregory Hines, Suzanne DePaz. I am not afraid to say that I'm brilliant. Yet after having made 2 documentaries, each shot in 8 different states, I simply can't get a job behind the scenes in Hollywood. And what really frustrates me to no end, and you know what, guys, this ain't gonna be politically correct. When I see women with fewer credentials, far less qualifications, less experience, get hired for jobs, in the wake of the Me Too movement, that I can do in my sleep. Yes! Really. Who is raising the alarm for participation? I have demonstrated my capableness, but who is speaking on behalf of people like me? Because we are innovators, we are capable, but who is speaking on our behalf? I made my documentary, Black Women in Medicine, to counter implicit biases about women depicted in media. I never imagined that during the course of making that film, that I myself would experience biases about being a quadriplegic. Yet, every day, I was more biases about being a quadriplegic than it was about being black. So let me explain. Filmmakers dream about getting their work approved by the Academy for consideration. That was my dream for Black Women in Medicine. There are very stringent requirements for securing Academy approval, including premiering in a New York Academy-approved theater. So we found the theater, last minute, off-Broadway, Academy-approved, that said they were wheelchair accessible. And I was like, great, because I'm in a wheelchair, and I want the disabled community to experience a director from their community 2 weeks beforehand, and I live in Connecticut. My co-producer went down to do a site visit, only to discover that what they said was wheelchair accessible was broken. And even if it wasn't broken, it wasn't adequate. Do you know what it felt like? This is you're at the big crossroad, and you can't even see your own film make its debut. But we got over that. During another post-screening, as the film gained traction, someone in the audience said to me, "Who directed your film for you?" I said, "What do you mean?" And she replied, "Well, we know you didn't do it." Now, even after a lifetime of experiences, of biases, based on race, now it's based on a disability. Ignorance knows no shame. No shame at all. I was completely taken back. We have to change the narrative about people with disabilities, our capabilities, our competencies, our ability to achieve and contribute. You know what I think of our community as? Grace under fire. Because every day when I go outside, I am under some sort of fire. Whether it's a sidewalk, whether it's somebody walking, flicking their cigarette at my height, hitting me and then saying, "You people get out the way." Now, if I was able-bodied, that would have been a serious ass whooping. But the best I could do was run into him with my scooter. We have to change the images that are portrayed in media, and it is up to us. We have to be part of that mainstream. We have to do that, particularly to help assist the current workforce and the workforce in the future. We have to. You know, research has documented that when it's a diverse pool of talent, that the return is bigger for that company. And why is that? Because it's different ideas, it's different perspectives. You know, you bring that difference and you make it better, not worse. Yet, that is not true about Hollywood. You know, we keep seeing the same old stories with the same old issues. And yet, you take a person like myself or like one of you, that we all have the same thing. We want love. We want to be safe. We want to have a certain standard of living. We all want that. And yet our different spin on that story is always left out. I am a woman who is loved. You see these handsome guys with me, right? I know you noticed them. Yes. And I'm a woman who loves. And yet, I never see somebody like me in the A Kiss Begins with K commercial. I'm married. I deserve a diamond. So, as a content producer, when I'm directing, I bring all those experiences to the table. I am not a brilliant filmmaker because I'm a quadriplegic. I'm a brilliant filmmaker because I'm creative and talented. And the quadriplegic aspect of my life gives me a different insight into how to live. But it does not define who I am or who I'm capable. And it should not define you either. everyone in this room can do something more. Everyone in this room considers themselves part of the I know somebody. Each of us has a one touch where we can reach out. And all it does is take one touch. You can do a little more in helping get a young person with a disability an internship, a writing job, a producing job. Because you know, in the entertainment business, it is all about what? Who you know, and about who you don't know. So, I'm going to leave you with a story. My first feature film I worked on was called Rage in Harlem, and it was directed by Bill Duke. And Bill insisted that I come work in Cincinnati for 6 months on this film. One of the producers, production supervisor, said to me one day, you know, you're a liability on set. I was actually relegated to the production office. And I was like, do I look like a secretary? So I said something to Bill. He had me on the set. And that day had to make special accommodations. So, you know, the regular vans couldn't fit my scooter, but they, you know, Bill worked it out. So the production supervisor cornered me one day and said, you know, you're a liability on set. And I just looked at him, I said, dude, how am I a liability? A grip 20 feet in the air with a tool belt is more of a liability than me, my leg braces, and scooter. And he just looked at me and walked away. Later, one of the ADs, H.H. Cooper, overheard the conversation. He said, Crystal, I'm going to teach you stuff that you will always get a job on a film set. He taught me union. He taught me how to count film stock. He taught me all of the paperwork. And from that day on, people hired me. But the point being is, oh, I forgot, that same production supervisor, the electric team got fired at the end of the week because they destroyed somebody's chimney. So who was the liability? Me or them? Point being here, we can make a difference, and we gotta change the narrative. You know, we have to change the narrative. And we can do that. We can join together. We can help each other. You know, it's not about me, it's not about Jennifer, it's not about John, it's about the collective. It's not about mental health, it's not about autism, it's not about physical challenges. We have to look at the bigger picture. Pool our resources, not just money, but our resources in human capital, who we know, and say, I need you to do this one favor. You do it, you do it, you do it. We began to build a tsunami. So, media is our way to change that narrative. And that is what I do. I believe I believe ordinary people can do extraordinary things. But since everybody in this room are extraordinary, imagine what we could do collectively. Think about that. Let's take it to the streets. Let's demand that we are seen. Jennifer and Respectability, I really, really thank you for this opportunity. I think everybody in this room, as you think about what you can do, think about the economic impact, because a lot of times people don't know how to do the right thing, but they know how to change when the dollar is attached. And the disability community is the largest marginalized group. And if we pull together, we do have power. So, Hollywood, get ready, because we are coming. Hollywood or bust. Namaskar.
I think Crystal points out a really good point. You know, if you're a teenager, you could turn that phone off really fast, but us older folks, it takes a while to figure out how to get that thing off. Anyway, but I was going to say that I think what she reminds us is that although we're making progress in terms of the way people with disabilities or all abilities are represented in front of the camera, with shows like Speechless and wonderful documentaries like this, and what Sesame Street is doing, behind the camera, where you have writers, editors, directors, producers. We still have a long way to go. It will, it's not a battle that's easily won. It'll have to be fought every day, and it will require everyone to do their part at trying to help people, give people a hand to take those jobs. It's so easy for people to just hire their friends and not reach out beyond their core group. And I think unless we do that, you're not going to see real change. Great, I think we are pretty much done. Jennifer, did you have a question before we move on?
We're very limited on time, but I would like each panelist to just briefly give a word of advice to the disability community. We want our voices to be heard, and we want positive role models to be on screen and behind the camera telling stories. Can each of you give us a piece of advice on what we as a disability community can do to advance an inclusion agenda?
Well, I guess we're going to go in the same order as before, so I'll jump in first. You know, when Harvey Milk was asked by a younger activist what was the best thing he could do to advance gay rights, Harvey Milk said, go out and tell someone. And I think there's a real need for the disability community to be visible to the able-bodied community, and the real need for members of the disability community to reach out to the other side. Some people actually are enemies and want to take services away from people who have disabilities and have all kinds of other dire purposes, many of which are being played out, unfortunately, on a larger scale in this administration than they ever have been before. But many people are just ignorant. Many people don't have contact with people with disabilities. The media representations are incredibly important, but so is the person-to-person. I'm a huge believer in the grassroots. And I think if you go and make yourself as visible as you can, if you go and talk to people, if you talk to strangers, if you talk to people you know, if you represent over and over again the validity and worth and integrity of your life with a difference or a disability, that will have a greater effect on public perception than all the policy papers that can be issued.
And I have to agree with Andrew. I would say that it's not unlike representation of race in the media. I personally, I've done quite a lot of work, a lot of films about African American history in the last 5 years, and my directing partner is Black, and the partnership between the two of us has been really unique and extremely fruitful, because the way we talk about it is our country's racial history is as much about being white as it is about being Black, and it's the combination that I think can produce some of the most interesting content. And I think with disability, I know that it's a highly loaded and political issue about representation on who tells these stories. And I think the more open we can be about both of us telling these stories, the more interesting the stories are going to be. I think there's a lot about this conversation between people with disabilities and people who don't have disabilities, but about perception and bias and about the way we see each other that has great potential. So I guess, I don't know if this is advice, but I think the more conversations we can have, and the more we can have them publicly, and the more we can have them in the media, the more progress we're going to make, because we're in this together.
I'll follow up on what was said beforehand in the context that it is telling the stories and spreading that word. I do go back to why I'm here, the belief that it is also coming from those that we think least. Kids' stories and having that perception from early on of inclusion and using social media and that context along with grown-up stories and what we often say is a powerful medium of getting personalization. And more than ever in today's world, that personalization is what makes a difference in terms of media and social media in particular.
You know, my word is courage. My word is courage and determination. And Jim, are you still here? There's a guy named Jim that I met, and this other gentleman from Atlanta, this gentleman here. Courage. I need to go to LA, and right now I can't fly, right? And I am so afraid of all the horror stories, but it's courage. Like, we need courage to come out of our difficult zone and be public about it. You need courage to stand in your truth, courage and persistence. And I think that sometimes when you have a disability, that you're exhausted. You're just exhausted trying to get through the day. And you just need a little more courage and a little more perseverance. And when people around you eventually see that you're not going to give up, they join you because they see that triumph of the human spirit. And it makes it more common as specific to you being deaf or you being in a wheelchair. And so what I say is courage, and find courage in those around you. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you to this panel. It's phenomenal. Thank you all so much.